when you work with other people, you probably do not always agree. Well, maybe when you work for someone who only has a culture of people either have to say yes, definitely, or okay, boss, then you might work for someone where anyone pseudo agrees. However, we're now talking about the case of reasonable leadership or even excellent leadership where criticism should be openly welcomed. However, when I ask you, are you open for criticism? Normally, I get one of these shotgun answers. Yes, criticism is great. It's great for getting ideas and innovation and solving problems. I love criticism. I consider every criticism as excellent feedback and as useful feedback, or even negative feedback helps me to grow. Blah, 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 blah. And let's face it, we do not appreciate all criticism. However, many leaders tell me they appreciate criticism and looking into their organizations. What I see there is pretty far away from what they claim how the organization works. And the question today is, based on the case of the BBC, handling internal and external critics and criticism is a key component of what you need to be able to do. And for the ones who have not heard about the scandal that the BBC recently produced, BBC took Gary Lineker off air at Match of the Day. And no worries, this episode is not about football at all. And now you say, well, sometimes someone who's a commentary simply is over their due date and you take them off air. This is not the case here. Gary Lineker publicly on his private social media profile criticized the government. And he criticized the government in a way, and when you probably heard of what happened recently in the UK now has new guidelines where they say when someone illegally immigrates to the UK, they cannot apply for asylum, etc., etc. Even immediate commentary from the government and the cabinet itself in publicly available documents says that they think this is not comply with international law because it isn't, and this can never be legal when it's challenged in the European Court of Human Rights, which it will be. So it's nothing else than straightforward populism. And Gary Lineker was exactly right when he said, and I know this is harsh criticism, especially in the British context, Gary Lineker compared the language of us versus them that the British government now shows constantly, because the British government now tries to play something up because they know an election is coming up probably in the next 2 years. They have to. And their track record is so catastrophic that they can only play on a nationalist agenda with an us versus them propaganda approach. And Gary Lineker compared their language to Germany in the 1930s. I know this is harsh criticism, but here and now off the record, but still publicly available in this podcast, dear UK government, if you do not want to be compared to 1930s Germany for the way you speak and you communicate, here's a top tip. Taking the person criticizing you off air and silencing them on all media channels, it's really not the hot take you think it is. It's basically the confirmation of what they claim against you. So when you look at the answer then, because of course the BBC was immediately publicly challenged, there is a huge outrage going on in the UK right now. And we will talk about today how open are we really all for criticism, and where is criticism based, how can we approach it, and where actually is the moral reasoning behind that? And how can we conclude to moral reasoning and how moral a leader or an organization is based on their behavior towards criticism? And of course, the BBC had to make a statement about this. First, the BBC said they take Gary Lineker off air until, and I quote, "we found an agreement about his social media use in the future." I have no idea. These are media professionals who think that someone should have an agreement what they can and cannot put on their social media, on their private social media. It is not a work social media. And of course, that didn't go down well. And then the BBC general manager, Tim Davies, said it's all about impartiality and they want to avoid any kind of conflict. And when Gary Lineker, who works for the BBC, criticizes the government, then it's, according to Mr. Davey, probably against impartiality. On a side note, the exact same Tim Davey is a former candidate for the Conservative Party and is the deputy chairman of the Conservative Party in Hammersmith and Fulham, which for whatever reason does not seem to be a conflict of interest or affect the impartiality of the BBC. So double standards, anyone? The question here is, who is allowed to comment and what are they allowed to comment? And I give you a simple example. Let's just imagine you are a leader in a business. It's your business, or maybe you're working for a larger business, and someone criticizes what you do publicly. And let's just think through the different roles. So someone who is doing it vocational training with you does that, or maybe an employee does that, or maybe a team leader does that, or maybe someone from the management. And now you probably feel the heat under your chair going up a bit, and maybe you think it's senior management. Or what happens when someone from the executives is going to make such a statement? Maybe even about you. What about when the CEO of a publicly listed organization maybe even makes public criticism of a government or any practice in the real world that can be seen somewhere? What about when boards criticize publicly, or supervisory boards, or any external consultant? And you see the exact same question, should they be allowed to comment, do you care, now probably ranges from, I don't care whatever they say on their social media, to this is absolutely unacceptable, they need to be removed immediately. And that's exactly the question we have today, how to handle criticism, internal and external critics and criticism. How to do it better than the BBC has done, because the BBC miserably failed. How to do it better. So first, freedom of speech is not debatable. It's not up for negotiation. It is there and it will remain. In any democratic society, people are allowed to speak up. There is a certain limit of what you can say, because your right to freedom of speech ends as soon as you limit the freedom of others. So, for example, if you would publicly say, I think that public servants are all lazy, I had to wait 6 weeks for my new passport, everyone should get up and punch them in the face and go straight to the office and give them 2 punches in the face every one Monday and Wednesday. That's illegal. This is why you should never say that, because there are certain limitations, especially when you incite violence, limit the freedom of others, etc., etc. There are hate speech laws. In every democratic society, there are certain limits. Probably the most extreme example of what you can say is in the US, and then there are certain limitations in every democratic society. But as a general rule of thumb, you can say whatever you want, wherever you want, as long as you live in a first world country that is run democratically. The BBC, however, here showed a very poor move, miserable management. And I want to be dead clear, because I know I'm going to receive emails about this afterwards. Tim Davie, the general manager, has to step down. There is no question about this. When the scandal happened, I waited a couple of days to just see what's going on there, wait for the statement. And I read through the press reader the BBC gave and through all the public sources. And the BBC gave a lot of sources, and very repetitive, very much in the middle of anywhere, very much I'm not saying anything but saying something, except we are taking Gary Lineker off air for criticizing a democratically elected government. Well, here are the news. It's allowed to criticize them, full stop. So Tim Davie has to step down. There is no question about that. He is the final and the top person to be accountable for how badly this scandal developed. He didn't handle it well. And of course, there are differences. It's a difference if a freelance person criticizes your company or your organization or someone who's employed with you. It's a difference if you are a public servant or if you are employed somewhere in free enterprise. It's a difference if it's some random person on the internet or if it is someone who works for you. However, censorship is never acceptable. It is morally unacceptable. And that's the word we need to talk about. Where do we get the morals from? And there is a model which we can refer to, because, as you know, I do whatever I do based on science, proof, and evidence, not based on opinion and personal interests or personal views. So the first level we have to look at, and when we look into the 6 stages of moral development, which I will give you the scientific source at the end for that, the first level which you develop as a child is avoiding punishment. You show certain behaviors, you get punished, so you avoid these behaviors. That is the level 1 of moral reasoning, moral development. You avoid punishment. A bit later, as a child, you develop self-interest, and you realize that you want to get the self-interest done. However, probably you remember as a child, or probably when you have children, you see that sometimes they're a bit clumsy in the beginning to put their self-interest through. And that's where they start to learn. By the way, these 2 stages, the avoiding punishment stage and the self-interest stage, are called the pre-conventional stage, normally with children up to the age of 6, 7, 8 years old. When you go to the 3rd level, it is the so-called good person attitude. You suddenly realize that there are external ethics as well. So when you want something from someone, you have to be nice to them or have to do them a favor. Or there are certain unwritten rules that you suddenly realize when you enter the so-called conventional stage of moral development. So first, it is the good person attitude. Be a good person towards probably not everyone, but many people you want to either work with or stay with or like or have friends. something you want to get in return, the good person attitude, followed by level number 4, the law and order morality. You suddenly learn, and that happens normally until the age of 13, 14, 15, somewhere there, that you realize there are certain laws in place to keep society together. Certain things are allowed, certain things are not allowed. Probably you realize that when you start to have the wish to drink alcohol and you realize, oh, I'm not allowed to, why not? Or have a cigarette, why can't I do that? Because there are certain laws in society to protect people from harm and protect others who cannot protect themselves. So level 4 is the law and order morality, which is the end of the conventional stage. So we have avoiding punishment and self-interest in the pre-conventional stage, and we have the good person attitude in the law and order morality in the conventional stage. The highest levels are the levels 5 and 6. And level 5 is the social contract. You suddenly realize other human beings are around and we have a social contract together. That does not mean you're nice to absolutely anyone. I wouldn't be nice to anyone who is transphobic or racist or anywhere near there because I don't want to have anything to do with them. But when I want to have to do something with you, I'd probably be a nice person to you, at least to a certain extent, maybe because we work together or we rely on each other as suppliers, or because I like you and you're a friend. The social contract we have in the highest level is level 6. These are principles, moral reasoning and personal ethics that are simply principles where you say, I follow these principles no matter at what cost. So the highest level is the so-called post-conventional model. That happens in adulthood, from adolescence to adulthood. Moral reasoning, and that is based on personal ethics. And when you now think, and I just heard it a couple of weeks ago in a seminar, in a workshop that I led, where someone said, oh, Mr. Brabandt, this is very interesting. We should tell managers about these new scientific outcomes. When science finds something out which is so important, they need to communicate way faster. We need these models in free enterprise. And here are the news. This model was found out by Lawrence Kohlberg in 1958. It is not top news. It is not the hot take of the week. It is nothing they found out last week. It is commonly known how important this model is. It is commonly known how important the model is for free enterprise. And it's especially well known how important this model is when it comes to decision-making, dealing with other people and dealing with criticism. However, enough people in free enterprise or the state or the government or wherever else, especially people who have a lot of power, have no interest to put this model into the knowledge of the general public, because suddenly someone could judge and say, I think with your development, you didn't do too well. And of course, you could always say, well, it's very personal. There's no right or wrong. Well, there is at least an agreement in society what we accept or do not accept. Otherwise, there wouldn't be this public outrage to support Gary Lineker at the BBC after public censorship from a senior level from the BBC, who is not only a Tory former candidate, but a Tory member of the Conservative Party, who clearly follows his own interest and puts in place a censorship that was led by the government idea of not being criticized publicly by a favorable person of the general public. So the BBC here failed on every single level, on any available level. The only consequence now that the BBC has to show is Mr. Davey has to leave. And consequences now can show that the BBC does not accept such behavior by a senior executive, a senior leader. Or the BBC shows that they actually are accepting this behavior, which will make them lose a lot of credibility in the future. And when it comes to the fact, how do you deal with criticism? And of course, we have certain rules. We have NDAs, because one question I frequently get, people often ask me, if you see something going wrong with a client, would you address that publicly? So there is it always comes down to what most experts say, it depends. So first, when someone openly violates laws, of course, I wouldn't keep that secret. When someone beats someone in the office and commits grievous bodily harm against them, I would, of course, report that to the police. There's no question about it. And I would not go via any internal kind of means. When someone is openly criminal, of course, that has to be handed to the police, which still does not mean that I have to put it to public, because probably, and of course, that also is part of legal consequences. When you put it to public, they could always claim that there was a prejudgment, so they are already judged by society, so they now needed to be treated soft in front of court, which you do not want to happen. If I see something going wrong with a client, I would always address it internally first. And when it is something which is based on opinion, or we can agree to disagree, fair enough. I do not always get my point. That's part of the consultancy job I do. However, when I see something wildly going wrong, and I have people who approached me, wanted to do seminars with me, and suddenly someone said, and I quote, suddenly someone says, Mr. Brabandt, we see on your LinkedIn and Facebook, there's a lot of this LGBT stuff, this woke thing. Could you tone it down a bit? And I said, no. And I said, I didn't only say no, I said no with another word in front of it, and the word started with F, which I'm not going to air here. No, absolutely not. I am not going to tone it down because you obviously have problem with equal and human rights. And that is the point where you have to publicly criticize organizations when you do not find any kind of agreement. I criticized certain companies for being absolutely hypocritical during Pride. They don't do anything for the community anytime, but as soon as there's Pride and they see, oh, target audience we can sell to, let's put a rainbow anywhere. And I publicly criticize people and organizations. And do you know what happens? They can handle it. When I last year criticized IBM for putting a rainbow flag absolutely anywhere except in the Middle East, where we do not have equal rights for the LGBTQI plus community, I addressed this publicly on LinkedIn, called it hypocritical, word by word, and I had a discussion with people from IBM, a reasonable discussion, where we even agreed that things have to change. The manager agreed with me. However, I could see his point that this will not change from today till tomorrow in an international business setting. And more left-wing people would probably disagree with me and say, oh, you have to push harder. This is not how the corporate world works. However, criticism can be handled by professionals. The question is, are you one? When you simply have the idea, as soon as you face criticism, and of course we all have rules, we have NDAs, and all these rules are in place for a very good reason. I never broke any kind of NDA, and I never put anything into public that shouldn't be in public. Not a single time in my whole life have I done anything wrong with information that was handled to me. But when you decide to simply silence criticism, I can tell you how we need to conclude on that. When you silence criticism, so first, it's undemocratic. So you're not part of the democratic spectrum. Second, it is morally underdeveloped, very politely said, morally underdeveloped, and it's ethically unacceptable, respectively fascist, straightforward fascist. And the question is, when you know that silencing criticism is an act of a non-democratic person, someone who's not in the democratic spectrum, when you know it is morally, politely said, underdeveloped, and it's ethically unacceptable or straightforward fascist, what is your decision on it? And you now see that acting on criticism is never based on selectively listening to some people, normally the people where you have a social contract with, where you know I'm relying on them, I work with them, and as soon as other people from a different level of the organization handle your criticism and you say, these are just the frustrated losers who have no clue about the business. Of course, not every single person is able to make a statement that is reasonable. Not every single person enjoyed the same privileges as probably most of you who are listening to this podcast did. Not every single person has the same level of education, where we learned how to make a reasonable point and have a civilized discussion. Some people went through horrible times and simply lost their temper or reached the end of their tether in due course of facing an unjust world. And then we should still listen to the core point of their argument. Of course, we prefer when someone addresses something respectfully, which, by the way, Gary Lineker did. But we cannot say we silence criticism because I don't have time for this, or I simply do not want to deal with this person for reason X, Y, Z. And that is the point where you have to make a decision, because the main question is, where do you stand on this? Your call. And of course, I published on this. So when you now say, hey, that is a very complex topic, and I agree it is, if you have any kind of open aspect where you want to talk about, any point of discussion that you want to make, just drop me an email, nb@nb-networks.com, and then we take it from there. If you say, hey, we need someone who delivers the topic, either leadership training or presentation training about that, or how do we communicate decisions? If you say we need training, speaking, coaching, whatever else, just drop me an email as well, nb@nb-networks.com. But of course, we can just chat about your topic as well. So it doesn't cost you a penny. Looking forward to hearing from you. The second aspect I always recommend is, when people want to know what I publish, and I give free access to everything that I publish. However, the access is only available via one source, expert.nb-networks.com. When you go to that When you go to that domain, you can put your email address in there and you receive only one email, and it is the email every Wednesday morning where you have free access to anything I published. expert.nb-networks.com. Very important to sign up there so you can get free access to anything. But the most important step is aspect number 3. And step number 3 is to apply what you heard in this podcast, because only when you apply what you heard, you will be able to see the positive change that you want to see in your organization. I wish you all the best implementing these principles in your organization. Always happy to help you and have a discussion with you. And at the end of this podcast, there's only one thing left for me to say. Thank you very much for your time.